as Tom said, I work for the Religious Freedom Project. I'm the senior project associate there. And working at the RFP, I'm constantly confronted with issues of rising restrictions on religious freedom, with the human rights violations that go along with those restrictions, and with some really staggering statistics on growing hostilities. And one of those statistics that's been mentioned today by Tom, but that really merits repeating, is that 77% of the world's population lives in areas with high or very high restrictions on religion. And that's 3 out of 4 people, so just let that sink in for a minute. 3 out of every 4 people live in these kinds of communities. And I think it's fair to say that at least half of these people, just by common statistics, are women. And I would venture to say that it's probably even more than half that are really affected quite dramatically by these restrictions. And that's what this panel is going to talk about today. So what I really want to get out of this conversation is how women and girls are faced with violence, are faced with oppression and hostilities that are unique to the fact that they're women. What happens to them that's different from their broader faith communities, and why? What is it about being a woman that maybe causes them to be persecuted in more or harsher ways than their broader community? And then also, on the positive side, we want to talk about unique ways in which women of faith can promote peace and can promote security, women's rights, and religious rights around the world. So to talk about these issues, I have 4 excellent panelists on stage, and they'll all be able to give us insights into different areas of the world, different communities. So I think we'll have a nice broad picture view by the end of our 90-minute discussion. And to my very far left is Jackie Rivers. Jackie Rivers came down from Boston. She's the executive director of the Seymour Institute on Black Church and Policy Studies, which seeks to create and promote a philosophical, political, and theological framework for a pro-poor, pro-life, pro-family movement within the ecumenical Black church. And that's both domestically and internationally. And on top of that, Jackie has lived and worked among the poor for the last 27 years. So welcome, Jackie. And next to Jackie is Helen Alvaré. Helen is a professor of law at George Mason University, where she teaches and writes about family law and also law and religion. She advises Pope Francis's laity council, especially on women's issues, and she also participates in a lot of public discussions concerning sex, marriage, parenting law, and culture. So she's very well versed in this area, and we're excited to have her on the panel. Then we have Aisha Rahman. She's the executive director of KARAMAH. I think I got that right. And she also serves as the head of the organization's Civil Rights Division. Now, the word KARAMAH means dignity in Arabic, which I think will be important to this discussion and is an important part of her organization's mission. They're a nonprofit organization that works to educate, to advocate for, and to provide legal services for people all around the world, but particularly for Muslim women. And Rahman came to KARAMAH from Legal Aid of East Tennessee, where she was a staff attorney litigating domestic violence cases. And then finally, we have Elizabeth Cassidy, right here to my left. She's the Deputy Director for Policy and Research for the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom. Before the commission, Cassidy worked at the UN Watch in Geneva, and then she also, before that, worked as a legal consultant to several human rights NGOs in Windhoek, Namibia. So we're very excited to have all of you. And without further ado, we'll jump into our first question. And I'd like to start with you, Elizabeth, since your work with the commission kind of gives you a broader view of what's going on in the world. Could you just tell us a little bit about what kinds of religious persecution you see in various parts of the world, and specifically how the experiences of women differ from the broader communities?
Sure. Thanks, Claudia, and thanks everyone for coming, and to the organizers, the Religious Freedom Project and the ABA for having this great event and for inviting me to speak. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Commission, we were created by the International Religious Freedom Act, and our mandate is to monitor religious freedom conditions around the world and make policy recommendations to the U.S. government. Now, we tend to focus on the countries with the worst problems because a big part of our mandate is to recommend to the State Department those countries that we feel meet the statutory standard in the Act for countries of particular concern. So really the worst of the worst, the egregious violators of religious freedom. So I'm going to be focused on some of the countries in that category, and I know then others are going to focus on other countries in other regions where there are issues, although not the sort of violent type of persecution that we're mostly following. And so in thinking about this, there were some definite ways that came to mind to me thinking about this and talking with some of my colleagues, reviewing what we've been reporting on in our annual report. Our most recent one came out in April about the ways women and girls suffer persecution differently than men. So one very obvious thing and very horrible thing, of course, is sexual violence. And in our past report, our most recent report, one of the major developments, major issues was the rise of ISIL in Iraq especially, also in Syria, and what all that entailed. And so in particular for the Yazidi community and the horrible abuses that Yazidi women and girls have suffered. And we had been following the situation in Iraq for quite some time, and the Yazidi community had already been marginalized, discriminated against, persecuted for a long time. But this sort of took it to a new level. The rape, the selling into slavery, these sort of violations. It made for a very difficult, it was a difficult experience for all of us just researching it, writing about it, in the report. So that was one immediate example that came to mind. You also see similar abuses by Boko Haram against Christian women and girls in Nigeria. Sexual violence, though, isn't only being committed by sort of these organized, groups that are getting all this attention, though. We continue to report on and hear about cases of forced marriages and forced conversions of Hindu girls, for example, in Afghanistan. Hindu and Christian girls in Pakistan. So it's not only organized, these sort of more organized, prominent groups, but also other actors within society. And then you also get these appalling sexual abuses perpetrated by governmental actors in some countries. So, for example, in Burma or Myanmar, another country that has been for a long time a country of particular concern, under the International Religious Freedom Act. There's been a long history of sexual violence by the Burmese military against women and girls in some of the ethnic and religious conflicts that have gone on for a long time in that society. And then also a long history of lack of accountability for the military and security force members who have been perpetrating those abuses. In addition, in countries like North Korea and Uzbekistan, these are countries where there are it's hard to get information, but probably tens of thousands of religious prisoners, including women, and so there are reports of appalling sexual violence and abuse against women prisoners in both countries. So that's sort of one of the very, very severe examples. Another case that we reported on in 2014 came out of Sudan and arises from another theme we see where you have a situation where the laws in a country or societal norms presume that a woman is of a certain religion regardless of her own conscience or choice. So you had a case in Sudan in 2014, a woman named Miriam Ibrahim. Some of you may have heard about this. She was convicted of apostasy and adultery and sentenced to death by hanging and 100 lashes. She said she was a Christian and had been raised a Christian, but a family member claimed that she was a Muslim and had been raised a Muslim and therefore had committed apostasy by converting, and she was married to a Christian man, so had committed adultery by being married to a Christian man. And a court in Sudan convicted her. She was put in jail with her 2-year-old son, and she was pregnant, and she gave birth to her daughter in prison. There was the story does have a happy ending, I'm happy to say, which some of our stories don't in this business, but there was a lot of attention to this case internationally. The US and other governments putting pressure on the Sudanese government. Her husband is an American citizen, so her children were American citizens too. And ultimately, her conviction was reversed, and she was released, and she's now in the United States. But the laws and policies and the sort of societal norms that led to this case still exist.
If I may just briefly ask a question, is that in Sudan, is it just women that this kind of conversion policy applies to, or is it?
No, I mean, no, apostasy is a crime.
Yeah.
But, this is sort of a case where it uniquely fell on a woman.
On a woman, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it also illustrates one thing with women's persecution as well, you can often see family member involvement. So this was someone in her own family who sort of turned her in. Another thing we've seen in some countries where women can be sort of presumed to be guilty because of things that their husband or their father did. So in North Korea, for example, the government imprisons entire families. So you could be imprisoned simply because of, someone in your family engaging in clandestine religious activity. I mean, that could also equally apply to men as well if someone in their family. But, and we also are aware of a case in Uzbekistan. Some of these countries hard to get information, but there was a specific case we referred to where a woman died in prison. She was only 37 years old. She had been imprisoned because of the activities of her husband and father, who were both independent Muslim theologians. So, governments going against someone, going against a woman because of her family affiliations. Another area where we see some of these restrictions and persecution relate to restrictions around marriage and childbearing. The situation in Burma has been mentioned, and it's for the Rohingya Muslims, it's one of the worst situations in the world. They're a stateless community, and also there's a really extreme degree of anti-Muslim sentiment. In last year or so, some of the way this has come out is with the passage of a series of new laws. There's a new interfaith marriage law that it's passed out of anti-Muslim sentiment, but actually restricts the rights of Buddhist women to marry someone from another religion. With the idea, again, this idea that sort of Buddhist women need protection against interfaith marriage, and so the new rule will be if a Buddhist woman wants to marry a non-Buddhist man, they have to get government permission. They have to publicize the intent to marry, and anybody can object, and an objection can stop a marriage. And also, if the woman is under 20 years old, she has to have the permission of her parents. That's an intersection of sort of religious issues, minority, majority. Anti-minority sentiment leads to restrictions on a woman of the majority. Burma also has just passed a new family planning law that's targeted at Muslim women, which will allow the government to impose restrictions on the spacing of children. It's not entirely clear how all this is going to play out. I mean, although there already have been for the past couple of years local restrictions in the state that has the high Muslim population, a two-child policy. But there are real concerns about this new law that authorizes governments to require the spacing of 36 months between births and how that will be applied and directed at minority women. As I mentioned, there are restrictions that fall on the majority in Burma as well with this new marriage law, but in a lot of these cases, you see an intersection, this was mentioned in the last panel, this intersection of discrimination where you've got someone who's both a woman and from a minority marginalized community and can be on both of those bases. And finally, just one thing to quickly mention, and this has been touched on in other countries as well, often one thing that you see about women and religious persecution, discrimination, there's a lot of issues around religious dress, and especially Muslim women's religious dress. But in some places, not only Muslim women, but this high level of concern about how women look, what they're wearing. Whereas there doesn't seem to be always the same concern about men, not so many restrictions on Muslim men wearing beards or Jewish men wearing, yarmulkes. So this is something that stands out when you review these issues, and it's been talked about in the previous panel about restrictions in Europe, but also to go back to Sudan. Sudan has public order laws, and these impose dress norms and behavioral norms. They're quite vague, indecent dress, but not sort of fully defined. And in our monitoring over the years, these are disproportionately enforced against women. You don't see enforcement against men for behavior or address. It's women, particularly women in minority communities. So, for example, these laws have been enforced to fine and flog both Muslim and Christian women for so-called indecent dress, which includes wearing trousers. Or having your skirt too short. I mean, and again, because the laws are so vague, it leaves it up to the discretion of local arresting, police officials, what indecency means. So those are very troubling. So there have been similar issues in Aceh, Indonesia, with enforcement of behavioral norms, where again they're supposed to apply to both genders, but the enforcement is overwhelmingly against women. And then we've, of course, already talked about the issue of headscarves for Muslim women, where you see some countries that require it and some countries that forbid it, where under a principle of religious freedom, women should have the choice. Right. So that's also one of the big ones.
That actually provides an excellent segue to Aisha. I mentioned before that she works with primarily Muslim women, and that spans the Middle East, Europe, and the US. And so, Aisha, I was hoping that you might give us a sense of the hardships that face these women on the basis of their gender and religion in these various parts of the world.
Sure, thank you. I also would like to echo what Elizabeth said and thank everyone for coming here this afternoon and for this very important topic. I think I'd like to talk a little bit first, just really generally. I think what we see whenever you talk about persecution, whether it's religious persecution or violence against women domestically and abroad, it really is, and this is kind of my DV hat coming in, DV 101 really teaches you that a lot of this persecution is about power and control. And I think that when we talk about gender and we talk about women and girls particularly being marginalized, maybe more, definitely more than men, it really is about an assertion of power and control, and they're seen as a vulnerable segment of society, and so easy to sort of mark and to persecute. So I'd like to talk a little bit about what's happening in Europe. I think that it's very, especially for Muslim women, there's a lot of cases that are coming out that are really changing the narrative of Muslim women's experiences. And I think one example is something that Elizabeth did already touch on, which is that whenever you talk about women, of course, part of patriarchy is to talk about women's dress. I think that that's the very popular sort of sexy thing to talk about when you're talking about women. And Muslim women, of course, are no different. And so I think that we see in the Netherlands and France and in Belgium, there has been very strict laws that have come out banning either the burqa or the head covering that is really affecting Muslim women and particularly Muslim girls. And I'd like to give you one specific case. KARAMAH has a summer program where we bring Muslim women from all over the world for 3 weeks to DC. And we teach them about Islamic law and leadership and conflict resolution. Because of a relationship that we had with the U.S. Embassy in Belgium, we actually invited, over the course of several years, about 30 Muslim women from Brussels and Antwerp who have gone back to their communities and have formed KARAMAH EU. And they are currently litigating a landmark case of a Muslim girl who was kicked out of school because she wore a head covering. And it was in the Flemish public school system, and there was a ban against her. They've recently had a success, which is that the initial court has overturned the ban, and so we're hoping there's still several more machinations of this case, and it's being fought on appeal, and there's definitely some issues that are happening. But I think what's really important to talk about when you're talking about this issue is to not focus on the dress element, but talk about how it's really impacting young women. In Europe and in the US, we have an identity, this is impacting Muslim women's identity and their pride in their religion and their access to basic rights such as education. So in the case of this young woman, she was kicked out of school, and when I went to visit the KARAMAH EU women, and we had several conversations with young women while we were there, the thing that was the most heartbreaking was that they were having to choose between their religion and their right to an education, and eventually their access to employment, to higher education, and to positions. And some of the women who did cover their hair and were in professional settings were telling me that, of course it's impacting the young women, but we've sort of grown up with this, and we're being marginalized in the workspace, we're being discriminated against in the workplace, and so it's really difficult for Muslim women to really rise. And so it's now leading a generation of women who are not really getting access to basic rights that we would all agree upon. So that's one major issue. The other issue I'd really like to talk about is what's happening in the UK with respect to registration of marriages. I'm not sure if that's come up at all today, but what's really interesting is that in the UK particularly, Jewish and Christian weddings, their religious ceremonies are automatically given credence and legitimacy by the state. Muslim, Sikh, Hindu weddings are not the same. So you have to go through several other processes for it to be considered a valid and legitimate marriage. And while people who are sort of naysayers of Sharia or of religion in general want to focus on the fact that, this gives, Muslims license to maybe have polygamous marriages. They want to focus on that issue. What they're not focusing on is by denying the legitimacy of religious ceremonies and religious marriages, Muslim women are denied rights at the time of divorce. And so, and custody and child support and spousal support and all of the various rights that you get at the time of divorce, and even rights within the marriage. And I think that is a very clear example. There's a whole movement that an attorney, her name is Aina Khan, who is working on these issues, and she's really leading a movement to start the registration of these marriages. But she has cited in several news articles that the numbers are very staggering. It's over 100,000 marriages that are not considered to be valid. Again, I'd like to also point out, so there's the obvious issues, but then there's also the subtle issues of what is the impact of this on people? What is the public opinion once you see that this marriage may not be deemed to be valid? And especially from a youth perspective, youth identity and this idea of being proud of your religion and your faith and who you are, if you are seeing that your rights are very clearly not the same as your other religious counterparts, it's really impacting the issue of identity, and that comes up later when we're talking about other kinds of issues that are arising with respect to of violence and other issues. So I think those two cases in the UK and in Europe are really something that we should be talking a lot more about.
Right. One of the things you brought up was, that these are all issues of power and control. And I think one thing that's interesting about Europe and maybe the West as well, and Helen can maybe talk about this a little more in the US, but I think it applies in particular to Islam, Islam is kind of seen as the antithesis to feminism in a lot of ways in Europe, and that the two cannot be compatible. You can't be, especially someone who wears religious garb, right, who wears the headscarf and is a feminist. Have you done any work on that, or could you comment on that a little bit?
Absolutely. That's our bread and butter, right, at KARAMAH. So KARAMAH, we are an educational organization. I didn't talk a lot about KARAMAH, but what we are hoping to do and we've been around for over 20 years, we want to really educate about Islam, because I think what has happened because of, and I'm just going to throw it out there, these sort of big words of patriarchy and Orientalism and this othering of Muslims, that is where these ideas come from, that you can't be Muslim and a feminist. And I think that what's very interesting to me whenever we have these conversations is that I think that the advent of Islam was to bring forth women's rights. And I think that if you study about Islam and its beginnings, literally the time in which Islam was revealed and the Quran was revealed to the Prophet Muhammad was described as a time of ignorance. And why was it a time of ignorance? Because of female infanticide, because women were definitely seen as property and second-class citizens. And then with the advent of Islam, all of this started to become reversed, and women started to enjoy the rights of voting, the rights of having equitable power in a relationship, financial rights, the right to have an education. And we see, and I could sort of talk for hours about the legacy of Muslim women from 1400 years ago that were bringing forth these ideas that they were, by any stretch of the imagination, feminists, as we think about it now. And I think that, this, because of patriarchy, because these narratives have been shifted to the side and in order to maintain power and control, we don't hear these stories anymore. And that started, frankly, right after the death of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. So we see that very shortly after his death, this idea of democracy in Islam was shifted to more authoritarian regimes, for example, which, and so this, I wouldn't say that the time of ignorance came back, but it takes a while to kind of get rid of those. So I think that absolutely, I think education is the way that we solve these issues. I think that we need to really educate about Islam and where it stands with respect to gender and gender equity. And I'd love to talk more about that as the panel goes on.
Great. And Helen, maybe feminism isn't the right word, but there's certainly kind of a conflict, I think, in the U.S. between women's sexuality and perceived women's rights, and females are just kind of caught in the crosshairs of all of this, especially when it comes to issues of religious freedom. So I was hoping you could maybe comment on that a little bit.
So in the United States, this narrative that women's freedom and religious freedom are opposed, I think it had its strongest start, the start that lingers into today. In the 1960s and 70s, two guys who founded the National Abortion Rights Action League, Larry Lader and Bernard Nathanson, made a conscious decision that in order to attain abortion's legality in the United States, you needed an enemy, because enemies get everybody riled up against one guy. And they decided that enemy would be the Catholic bishops. And this came out later when Bernard Nathanson, they founded the National Abortion Rights Action League, which still exists today. But Bernard Nathanson eventually pulled away from abortion and eventually published the papers and dialogues that he and Larry Lader had had. And that was the beginning of it, the idea that this church, characterized as anti-sex, anti-woman, women belong as mothers, and that's it, began to be characterized as the enemy of women's freedom. A more recent incarnation, and the one we're all familiar with from today's kinds of lawsuits, started to come about when the states, and then finally the federal government, began putting contraceptive and early abortifacient mandates into health insurance programs. They were in the states, but the reason you didn't hear quite as much about it, you might have heard something, is because they usually had various ways for religious entities to accept themselves. They could self-insure, they could stop giving them prescription insurance and do something else. But in any event, by the time we got to the federal mandate, which has been running through the courts now for a long time, I sort of judge how old I am by how long I've been working on the federal mandate. I can't believe it came out when it came out and that it's been that many years. But since 2011, in August, this has been a factor. And the federal mandate, while it allowed dioceses and individual churches, and presbyterates, specific religious entities whose sole job was to worship or proselytize, to be accepted from what's called the contraception mandate. It has in it all FDA-approved forms of contraceptives, and by the HHS's own admission, early abortifacients. They don't shy away from the fact that some of these drugs that are now mandated to be part of insurance plans take an embryo and shed it out of the womb. So religious institutions that are schools, hospitals, social services are not accepted. They have this accommodation where they have to either talk to HHS or their insurance company or their third-party administrator. And if they say to them, we're not going to put it in the plan, but you have to, basically. The federal government will put it in the plan, and all of their employees of these religious entities will have this insurance, and that's how it works. So the idea that this is women versus religious freedom, as you see, it depends upon the core notion that sexual expression without children is very, 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 very crucial to women's freedom. In fact, it's often posited as something like the core of women's freedom. You can trace this historically. You can go back to Freud, Marcuse, you can look at Foucault, you can look at de Beauvoir, you can look at Betty Friedan, et cetera, and it's very much there. Its modern expression is not quite so fancy. It was Kathleen Sebelius, who she said it at a lot of fundraisers that she would do for NARAL and Planned Parenthood. And then it's really said in the government briefs in these mandate cases that these little sisters of the poor or these Catholic hospitals, or actually there are more evangelical plaintiffs than Catholics, they are the enemy of women's being socially and economically equal. That's the government's argument. Anyone who won't give this out for free is preventing women from being socially, economically equal. That's the equation. Here's why that really doesn't work out, okay? And in fact, instills an ethic, if you will. The government is instilling an ethic that's trying to bump the religious ethic on sex, marriage, and parenting. But the idea that the government's ethic is pro-women and religion's is anti-women is just not proved out by the numbers. But let me just give you a couple pieces of that. Number one, the religions that are opposing the mandate are all religions where women affiliate more and practice more. Women announce their affiliation with evangelical Catholic religions more, and they actually go to services more than men on a regular basis. Number two, the institutions that are fighting the mandate were mostly founded by women and run by women, staffed by women. So again, the idea that this is religious freedom versus women's freedom just doesn't play out there. But number three, and a point that is really good to look at research on, I wrote a really long article on it. I brought a couple copies. I wrote an amicus brief to the Supreme Court, and I'll file it again when the Little Sisters case gets there, likely. It shows that the sex, marriage, and parenting ethic that the government is saying, hey, this is for women, in the end, if you really look at it, sex is nothing terribly special. Any particular encounter, the fact that it gives birth to new life is to be set aside and separated out. It's really not working out for women. Since the government got involved in promoting this ethic in the 70s, our rates of unintended pregnancy have actually gone up. Our rates of out-of-wedlock pregnancy have gone from 5% to 40%. Out-of-wedlock pregnancy is the #1 predictor of women's poverty. Women in the United States are about 86% of all single parents. And and here's where you'll know I'm from George Mason, the Law and Econ University, the whole sex, mating, and marriage marketplace is no longer to the advantage of women at all. It has set up an ethic where sex is the price of a relationship. Janet Yellen wrote the most definitive paper on this with her husband, George Akerlof, who is himself no slipshod economist. He won a Nobel Prize, showing that because of the phenomena of risk compensation, you were bound to have a situation where you'd have more out-of-wedlock births and more abortions with this new ethic than you had before. So this is a problem. It's particularly a problem for the poor. Wealthy people don't follow this ethic so much. They don't, as Charles Murray said, preach what they practice, but what they practice is get married, have your kids during your marriage, and so on and so forth. They tend to link sex, marriage, and kids more while the government is disaggregating them, and poor women are suffering the most from it. My final point is the government's interest really compelling on behalf of women? I mean, if you want to be flip about it, and I'd like to be for just a second, the government could have contracepted every woman in America with like lifetime supply with what it spent fighting these few religious institutions that have said, we just don't want to provide it for free. But to go back on not being flip, part of the lengthy research in my article is, it's not the reason women aren't accessing contraception. I mean, in addition to all this stuff about the harm that the current sex mating and marriage marketplace is doing to them, look at the Guttmacher stuff, look at Planned Parenthood's figures, look at the Center for Disease Control, look at NIH, look at the White House Office of Women and Girls. The data does not show that free contraception is what's preventing this tiny number of women who aren't using it from using it. There's a lot of women who hate it. There's a reason why about every year someone's paying about $2 billion out of a pharmaceutical company in order to settle health claims that women file. There's other reasons they're not using it. So this whole setup of sexual expression versus women's religious freedom, it doesn't pan out because of how women practice, and it doesn't pan out in terms of the sexual ethic. All these religious women are trying to do is say, a few of us would like to witness to the good of this ethic. It would be good for us, it'd be good for our kids, it would build a stronger society, it would particularly ease the gap between the rich and the poor. If more people practiced this ethic that paid attention to the link between sex and kids, even when you're not intending to have kids, paying attention to the weight of sex would help everybody. So that's what these religious women want. The government is on the other side of it now.
We'll revisit that, I think, in just a minute, Helen, but I did want to invite Jackie to speak a little bit. You were nodding some with some of the things that Helen was saying, so it seems like some of that resonates in what you see. I imagine, though, that the Black church in the U.S. also experiences some different situations for the women and faith community. So I'd like for you to maybe explain two things to our audience. First, what is the significance of the Black church to the broader Black community, and then especially to women within that community? And second, the kinds of threats and pressures that the Black church is faced with in terms of religious freedom and what effects those could have for the community.
So thank you very much, Claudia. And I'm really glad that we did talk about Boko Haram and the horrendous impact on women in Africa because of a lack of religious liberty. And it's not just Muslim extremists, but we also have the anti-Balaka in the Central African Republic. And in comparison to what's happening there, what's happening here is mild. So I just want to acknowledge that. But the Black church is really a very important factor in the lives of Black women. Black people are actually the most religious ethnic group in the United States. 9 out of 10 of all Black people are sure that God exists. Much lower numbers in the general population. And they pray, 76% of us are praying at least once a day. So we're very highly religious, very observant. And as Helen just pointed out, that's even higher among Black women. She pointed out that women are generally more religious. And so we're looking at a situation where for 84% of Black women, religion is very important. And for 60% of them, they're attending church weekly. So they're the most observant of any demographic group in the country. So the Black church is critical to them. The other thing I'd point out is that among Black people, even those who are unaffiliated, their sense of how important God is and their frequency of prayer is the equivalent of most Catholics and mainline Protestants, even though they're unaffiliated religiously. So this is really a key factor in the Black community, and the Black church really plays a very important role. I'm sure that most people know that Blacks don't vote at the same rate at which the rest of the general population votes, but the place where we are politically engaged is in the Black church. Most Black preachers are saying, look, we don't just minister to the people in our pews, we are ministering to our entire community. We're meeting needs of everyone. And that means by urging involvement in the political process, whether it's through voting or a much more common thing in the Black community is through the use of influence and lobbying and protesting. All of that is very much deeply rooted in the church. A great example, of course, is the civil rights movement. So but in addition to this political engagement, the Black Church really provides services. So we provide services at a higher rate, even though Black churches are much smaller and much poorer, we provide services at a higher rate than white churches do. And we are addressing the needs of the poorest in our community. So, and this is, I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with Ram Kanan's work, The Other Philadelphia Story, where he documents all of this. So, for Black women, the church is really a central part of our lives and a central part of the good that happens in our community. And I think the threat for us is that we're also then more socially conservative than the general population. We are more likely to oppose abortion and more likely to be against treating homosexual unions as marriage than the general population. In a society in which there is rising intolerance of faith and of taking a stance against the culture, that really becomes, to some extent, a threat to us in the Black community and in particular to Black women. So I'm sure many people know that the Canadian High Court found that this pastor who was distributing flyers against gay marriage was termed hate speech, and that there was actually a pastor in Sweden who actually served time for doing something similar. So at what point does the teaching that is common in the Black church, in the pulpits of Black churches across the country, at what point does that become hate speech? And given that how fragile these congregations are we at risk of actually having our doors close? And many people probably also know that Mark Oppenheimer ran a piece in Time magazine calling for churches to lose their tax-exempt status. Black churches won't survive that. You know, we're hanging on by a thread. We are providing services to the community primarily on volunteer labor, which we're better at mobilizing than Black church and the white churches are, but we won't hang on because we're barely keeping our doors open. We won't hang on if we lose our tax-exempt status. So for all of these reasons, it is really, religious freedom is a very critical important for the well-being of the Black community in general, but even more particularly for Black women.
Okay, thank you, Jackie. And maybe both of you could just, Helen and Jackie, could answer this question, then I'm gonna come back to Aisha and to Elizabeth. When we talk about, you know, these competing rights claims, we want to talk about, or I would like to talk about the positive way that we can kind of spin this issue. So not pitting them against each other, but talking about what women stand to gain by more robust protection of religious freedom for all, including those who oppose contraception. So you, Helen, you kind of talked about this being a problem, but what is the positive side of protecting religious freedom, and how does that benefit women in particular?
Right. You know, somebody said it this morning on the earlier panel about the protection of religious freedom being the protection of the freedom to serve, and you just highlighted that huge. I'm familiar with this one particular Black church that's cooperating with the USCIRF Institute that I deal with in New York. I think he's got like 5,000 kids through grade school in New York. And these are not all kids in his congregation. So the freedom is freedom to serve. And I'll say when the whole religious freedom tussle, women's freedom thing hit several years ago, there was a question about how to address it. Do you just say, I stand on the First Amendment, I stand on the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, those are my rights? And that would be very familiar in the United States. It's not just because, you know, I'm used to fighting that I thought, you know, I don't think that's a big, everybody's my rights. That's very US. What was that Marion Glendon book, Rights Talk, right? I said, we've really got to talk about, if you let us have our rights, here's what we'll do with them. And to me, one of the things we'll do with our rights are a continuation of some beautiful things we're doing already. One of the things I heard about in France when they did the headscarf ban, and somebody referred to it in in France with regard to young Jewish kids going to sometimes Christian schools as well as Jewish schools. All these girls from the Muslim tradition came into the religious schools because they were happy to have you with your religious garb, whatever it was. So to me, and I know this sounds a tiny bit Pollyanna, but I think there's room for it here. I travel all around the world, and when I come to the United States and I come to a place and see 5 different kinds of headdresses on a sidewalk in Virginia, I want to cry with happiness. Because that's who we are, that's who we can continue to be. I think a lot of religions have done a very good job on this. And I realize they haven't all. And some of the times religion is the exact opposite of this. But to the extent that we've done a good job on it, we should be invited to have our religious freedom. And the Faith-Based Initiatives Program under Clinton and still existing said this: make sure you take care of people of all religions. Perfect.
Required to.
Exactly. That's our genius writ larger. And so I do think we ought to have freedom. It always has to be freedom to serve. Tom Farr says, in the Catholic tradition, for instance, it says religious freedom within due limits. Totally cool with that, right? We can't hurt people. But our genius for giving every person the look of love they crave, allowing everyone to be God's child, I just think if that is drawn out, whether it's woman or man or whatever other religion we're talking about, we can be insisted to do that, and we can be invited to do that.
And I think that, again, one of the primary, Black children, 70% of all Black babies are born out of wedlock. So a lot of Black women are raising their children by themselves. And the Catholic Church, the parochial churches in inner cities, are a boon to a lot of those women because their kids thrive in those schools. Let us have our religious liberty so that we can serve the neediest. In addition to which, there's research that shows that just getting our kids into churches does good for them. Pat Fagan finds that means that they will do better academically. The more frequently kids are attending church, the better their academic performance. And Richard Freeman, a noted economist at Harvard, found many years ago that kids who were involved with church were less likely to get involved with, young Black men, were less likely to get involved with criminal activity. That's what we want our religious freedom for, to save our kids. And that's very important to Black women.
So moving to the international context then, a skeptic might say, well, if you let more religious actors exercise their faith in the public sphere, maybe in Muslim-majority countries, you're going to further destabilize already unstable areas. You could potentially have even more legislation that is harmful to women. Is there any argument to make that would be the case, or might greater religious freedom for everybody in these communities better the circumstances of women and of girls, and if so, how?
Do you want to go
Start or
first?
you want?
Either way, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Okay. I think that I like this question because I think, and I think Helen got me thinking about it as well, there's this notion that secularism brings or breeds religious freedom, or freedom in general, and one of those freedoms is religion. And I think that that's so ironic, especially when you're talking about Muslim-majority countries. I don't think that there's any doubt, and I would be too naive to say that there isn't religious freedom issues in Muslim-majority countries, and that we don't have persecution based on within the religion, so within Islam itself and sectarian issues, and then, of course, interfaith issues. That being said, so with that caveat, I think that religious actors and playing a role in the public square really have a duty to talk about the advent of religious freedom from an Islamic perspective. So I think that there is a verse in the Quran that is often cited with respect to this, that let there be no coercion in religion. It's very clear Islamically from a very authentic, from God's own words, that there should not be coercion with respect to religion. And that verse tracks very closely with our own U.S. Constitution and the idea of where religious freedom came from. There are scholars who are writing about the fact that Thomas Jefferson had a Quran and perhaps a replaced it after there was a fire burning most of his library. And so there's evidence that he was aware that the Quran was missing from his books that were burned. And so there are scholars, not me, who are doing some research on his influence from Islam, especially with respect to religious freedom. So I think that and where KARAMAH's sort of role comes into this is reminding religious actors and other political leaders in Muslim majority countries, if they are, fighting for Islam, and fighting may not be the right word, but if they are advocating for Islam, then they are advocating for religious freedom, because there's a rich tradition and history of that in Islam. And I think that, it's not just the Quran. There's a very famous charter of Medina, again, at the time of the Prophet, which gave Jews of that time, not only when we talk about the community. So when you go to any religious service for Muslims, they will often talk about the ummah, the community. And the Prophet was very clear about the fact that the ummah, the community, does not include only Muslims. It includes all people. And with respect to Medina, particularly the Jewish tribes were included in that. And they were explicitly given rights in that charter of equal rights to life, equal rights to protection. So I think that, we even in, so there's Muslim majority countries, and then there are countries that say they are governed by Islamic law. In those countries that say they're governed by Islamic law, if they are not doing right, then we need to further education. And I think part of that is through the education of women and girls with respect to these issues. But I think that there's ample tradition and history that cements the fact that religion secures religious freedom.
Great answer, thank you.
And just to follow on that, I also think that an organization like KARAMAH and these points that Aisha is making are exactly the example of why you need religious freedom and why it helps women. If more of these, there are a number of societies in the Middle East that have sort of been long-time authoritarian or sort of moving away from it, and we've seen in the short term it's unleashed a lot of illiberalism, a lot of groups who believe that they want to exercise their new freedom only for their own freedoms, not for the freedoms of everybody else. That's not real religious freedom. That's not the religious freedom that's protected under the international standards. It's religious freedom for everybody. And if you have real religious freedom, you empower groups to be able to make these points and makes these arguments in the public square about why religion supports religious freedom and what religion should mean, and you can empower women who for too long have been marginalized in these debates in many of these countries where all these debates are being controlled, frankly, by men. And we've seen what that has done for the place of women in many societies. So, in the short term, I think some of these new freedoms, it's a bumpy road. This isn't only in the Middle East, but I talked about Burma, where the new freedoms in Burma have unleashed this extreme Buddhist nationalism that is really restricting the rights, the rights of Muslims, and it's not only these groups within society, but these governments aren't yet allowing real religious freedom. There's not a level playing field. There are some groups that are being allowed to assert their rights and make these arguments and use the political process, and other groups that aren't. So if you have a robust version of religious freedom, which means religious freedom for all, you're then going to be empowering women, religious minorities, and dissenters within the religious majority. I mean, we talked about, I thought Representative Ellison put it really well when he talked about the right to be unorthodox. That there are many different versions of religions and many different ways that people within religions want to, live their own lives, whether it's to choose whether to wear or not to wear some particular religious garb or whatever it may be. And then the other thing is too, and this has been talked about earlier, to have real religious freedom, societies also have to protect all these other related rights, right? You can't have religious freedom without free expression, without freedom of association, freedom of assembly, all of these things that help create a vibrant civil society that allows all of these voices to compete. So, it's sort of what do you mean by religious freedom?
Right. So I kind of want to shift the conversation a little bit now, and I think you've all touched on this a little bit already, but on a panel when you're talking about religious persecution and women, it's very easy to talk about women as victims and to kind of deprive them of agency. So I kind of want to talk about them as agents. What can they do to promote peace and security? What can they do to promote women's rights? What can they do to promote religious freedom? And Jackie, I thought we could actually just start with you because you do work in communities so closely, kind of on the ground. What role do women of faith play in?
So I think that it's really, perhaps to most people it's the pastors who are the most visible, but 71% of the members in black churches in Philadelphia are female. We make the churches run. One of the things we do is without us, the churches wouldn't even be there. So that's a place of agency for us. And interesting work done by Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham at Harvard points to the fact that at an earlier point in the history of the black church in the early 20th century, black women were kind of this linchpin, working with white women on issues of social justice around childcare and things like that, and working with black men around issues of lynching. So we've always had the church as a source of agency for black women. So that's one of the areas. And even today, running after-school programs, running preschool programs, this is really important for us as black women, and the church is a place where we exercise that agency and where we gain formal and provide formal and informal support to each other. One example is also at the West Angeles Church of God in Christ in California. And they run probably about 20 programs that serve the community. They have done about $80 million in development at the West Angeles Community Development Corporation, which was founded by a woman and is currently run by a woman. So the black church is an important vehicle for the agency of black women.
Does anybody else want to answer that?
One thing, just because I founded something without meaning to, but it's women working on religious freedom exclusively, nearly. When the HHS mandate came down, I hope the guy I'm talking about isn't here. So this guy running the committee in Congress who was staffing the hearing to talk about religious freedom, he called me, and then in my place he put an older white guy. And I didn't testify for religious freedom in connection with contraception. Oh, that was good. And you had all these guys on the first panel, and then you had a few women on the second panel. So that night on the news, it was all the war on women, religions are waging a war on women, where are the women? And after calling him and saying a few, that was not wise, sort of things, I wrote a letter, a public letter, and I sent it to about 20 of my friends. And without another move on my part, over 45,000 women have signed the letter.
Wow.
And the letter said two things. Number one, women care about religious freedom, we're religious. Number two, whether you use contraception or you don't, you probably don't believe it's the centerpiece of your freedom. And so all these women who use contraception, women who don't, Mormon, Muslim, Orthodox Jewish, Evangelical, Baptist, Catholic, you name it, signed on to this letter. And then I thought, it's a nice database. So every 15 days, I send them out something, information. And they do stuff with it. So they have rallies, they urge their pastors to do stuff, they write letters to the editor, they write gorgeous editorials, they lobby. And this has been going on, and they do it constantly. And now I've got a Facebook page, it's up to 78,000 women, I put something on it, it gets shared 122,000 times. These are women for religious freedom. So I'm working on my next project for them. It's going to be a little surprise, but I hope it comes to your town soon. I'm not going to tell you what it is because it's still in the works. But these women, it turned out there's tons of women who really care about religious freedom. Why? because they're sending their kids to school and they want that school to be able to stay religious. Because one of them is running services for the disabled. She has 29 people whose full-time job is services to people in their homes for the disabled. She's got hundreds and hundreds of clients. She's going to have to close her business down if she's forced to violate her conscience. So I just dreamed up, just this letter, but these women, it turns out they have 100 different reasons to care, many different religions, both political parties. But it really surfaced for me that there is a market, if you will, my George Mason training again, for religious freedom as a women's concern.
I think just really quickly, one thing that I find really interesting is that there is this prevailing narrative of women and girls as victims. And I think we see that at every turn, and that's what the news is telling us, and that's what the idea of public opinion really is, especially with respect to Muslim women. Muslim women are the victims. Let us go liberate them and save them, which is a very problematic narrative. But I think what I find to be so interesting, and just this last week, KARAMAH hosted a delegation from Georgetown, from the MEPI students, who were coming from all over the Middle East. And in typical KARAMAH fashion, we talk a little bit about our work, and then we ask questions of the group, and a lot of them have to do with gender equity issues. And I find it to be so surprising because in my work, and sometimes I have to recognize that I'm in a vacuum and I'm doing work with amazing women. It was all the young women who knew the stories, who were talking about being religious and just knowing these amazing stories about Muslim women having agency, both in our historical traditions of major Muslim leaders, and then in the modern context. And the young men were just being able to listen to their peers and how much they knew, I think was very powerful. So I think, and when you talk about women bringing peace and being change makers, education is that critical component, and allowing women and making sure that they know that they have agency, because so often that agency is taken away from them, whether it's because of the public narrative or because of how they are told to be or behave. And it's, in fact, women are shattering that, every day, whether it's in the US or globally. So I think that education, I'm so biased because I just think that is where all of this, the root of all of this is. So,
Elizabeth, did you want to comment on that? Okay, I'm just going to check the time here. I see that when we give women agency, we stay on time. Very good at that. So I will throw one more question out there. Maybe for you, Elizabeth, since you work for the commission, and then we'll go to the audience questions. To the broader question of the conference, what can the United States do to advance international religious freedom? Why is it in our strategic interest? And what effect, and we've talked about this extensively already, could more robust religious freedom, and then following from that, better conditions for women in society have on our national interests?
Sure, and I'll try to stay on time. I lived in Switzerland for a few years, so you get really good at being on time. This has already been talked about a lot in previous panels, but I think there's increasing evidence coming out of a lot of work that's being done, including by Pew and Brian Grimm, about how important religious freedom is for stable societies, and that it's not. This is not just sort of good because it's a human right and, it's a value and it makes us feel good, but the societies who protect religious freedom are much more successful, they're much more stable, they're less violent, they have better outcomes for women and girls, health, all of those important things. So this isn't only good for sort of those countries individually, but it's good for the world, less extremism, et cetera. In these circles, I think this is widely accepted, but this has also been talked about even despite 17 years after the International Religious Freedom Act. I don't really think that has been fully incorporated in U.S. policy. I know that there are very good people at the State Department who really believe this and are working very hard on religious freedom and human rights, but still there are always all these other competing factors. And so when it comes, as someone said this morning, when the rubber meets the road, often the, what are deemed to be the more strategic interests overtake, right? So I do think there's still work that needs to be done to convince policymakers that this is really in the United States' strategic interest to do this. One other thing that's clear, so 17 years after the International Religious Freedom Act, last year in 2014 in our annual report, we did a review of sort of the policy overall that I urge you all to read. And found some successes, but unfortunately a lot of these successes have been what I talked about before, these sort of addressing the symptoms, addressing the individual cases, And this is really important, getting Miriam Ibrahim out of jail, getting other people out of jail. This is a very important human rights work. It makes a difference in people's lives, but the underlying problems are still there. So, and those are of course much harder to address. So how does the US engage with countries to convince them that having these laws and policies is not in their own interests? And that's what's really hard. And the other thing that I think becomes clear is that the US can't do this alone. We've had the International Religious Freedom Act for all these years. There have been some changes in some countries, but still the situation overall is really alarming. And to end on a positive note, one thing that's happened in the last few years that I think is really reassuring is that the US isn't doing this alone anymore. In the past few years, we've seen other countries make a particular effort to promote religious freedom internationally. The Canadians now have a religious freedom ambassador, like the US does. Some European countries have taken on a particular focus in this, the European Parliament as well. And also, in the past year or so, there has been an increasing effort to develop international networks. So there now is both an interparliamentary group, voluntary group of parliamentarians from all over the world, different countries, different regions, different political parties, who have been willing to commit to Article 18 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and to work together and engage, network, exchange information, work together on religious freedom issues. There's been a similar effort with governments, an intergovernmental coalition that's been starting to, share information, work on combined démarches, things like that. So, I think we're moving in a good direction, but there's still a lot of work to do.
Right. And Jackie, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, so I think one of the points that was made on the previous panel is really important, that the people who are working on these issues for the State Department not have the attitude that religion is, and I will be more blunt than the previous speaker was, an ignorant artifact from our superstitious past, that they not see religion in that light. I think that that's a very important move, and I think it's in the strategic interest of the US for a couple of reasons. First of all, because, with my apologies to Angie, radical Islam is proselytizing in the United States through social media. It's in our interest that we use every tool we can, including religious freedom, to take all of the air we can out of their sails. And because Africa is going to be the center of global Christianity in a couple of decades. And that is where much radical Islam is also gaining territory. So it seems to me that there is a possibility down the road that there's a real national security threat bubbling up, and that religious freedom, if we advance religious freedom in Africa, it's one of the tools to be used against what might become a very ugly situation in Africa, and with global consequences.
Well, thanks to all of the panelists, and we're gonna move now to questions. We're gonna do the same format as in the last panel. I'll take maybe 3 questions, and then we'll answer those, and then if we have time to take a few more, we'll do that. So there's a question right here in the green, and yeah, just raise your hands.
I think that it would be, thank you so much, it was very informative, but I think we would be remiss if we don't mention the issue of Palestine and the fact that the Palestinians don't have free access to the holy mosques. And actually, they have to go through a whole bunch of hoops to get permission, and families are not allowed to go together. Husbands and wives are not allowed to go together. Young people are totally barred from making a pilgrimage to the holy mosque. So I was wondering if USCIRF, for example, did any work in that, or if anybody had anything to say about that.
Okay, thanks for that question. There was another one here on the aisle. Can he just, yeah.
So this is for Elizabeth and Aisha.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but can I get your name as well?
Yes.
And your
My name is
affiliation?
Sarah Bells. I'm an intern at the American Enterprise Institute. I was wondering your opinion on the Let Girls Learn initiative, and specifically reading the documents, I think there's a lot of ambiguous language towards countries where there's remarkable lack of religious liberty. And so I was wondering if you have opinion on how that language could change, and if there is a place for that initiative to take on religious liberty.
Is everybody familiar with this
I'm not
initiative?
actually.
Could you just give a brief, maybe?
Yeah, it's basically just a funding movement supported by Michelle Obama, and
Is it
they're
an NGO on its own at this point? Is it already?
no, it's a combination initiative with the Peace Corps and a few other organizations, but they're funding primary schools and other education opportunities across the world. So,
Thanks. And then over here, Reverend Rivers had a question.
Very quick.
Yeah.
How do we have, in the interest of women, since 71% of them, and Jackie did mention also that they finance the churches. How do we discuss, given its impact upon women, the persecution of Christians in Muslim nations? Now, I know that's an impolitic question, but how do we begin to have the adult conversation about how we address that in a real way? We can talk about Israel and the persecution of Palestinians, and we should talk about that. But we should, when can we, and what's the context for the systematic persecution of Christians in Muslim nations?
Okay. Any other questions right now?
One over there.
Okay, one over here. We'll just go ahead and take that too.
Hi, I'm Eden Sung. I'm interning with the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission. And I was wondering, the primary reason for opposition to religion is because religion is perceived as oppressive to women, especially with cultural manifestations, in essence, people calling religious exercise, of interpretations of religious texts. How do you navigate the interpretation of these texts, which delineate certain understandings of gender based in religious values that people are increasingly attributing to antiquated social standards?
Okay. So we have several questions now. Again, Palestinians and pilgrimages to the holy mosques, and the issue of families being broken up and not being allowed to go. The Let Girls Learn initiative. Maybe we can just talk more broadly about, again, the importance of education for women in this complex that we've discussed today. How do we discuss the persecution of Christians in Muslim majority countries? And then this final question regarding religion as a vehicle of oppression for women. So take your pick.
Do you want me to-
Whoever
okay.
would like to.
Okay, I can start with the sort of USCIRF related questions. Yeah, you're absolutely right. There are real restrictions on access to religious sites and all of those issues for Palestine that USCIRF has monitored for years. I think you know my colleague Dwight. He's our Middle East person, so he's much more knowledgeable about the specifics of all of those. All of those than I am, but absolutely, you know, there are real concerns there about access to religious sites and those restrictions. What were the other? I can't comment on the girls' education initiative. I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with those documents. So
Yeah. Others were the persecution of Christians in Muslim countries or Muslim majority countries, and then the view that religion is kind of inherently oppressive of women, and how do we?
I mean, I'm not really going to take on
Okay.
a sort of more theological. I don't think that's my role on this
Yeah.
panel. But on the persecution of Christians, it's definitely a real concern, and there are places where Christian communities are basically being eradicated from, Iraq, Syria, places where they've lived for thousands of years because of groups like ISIL. I think it's countering, though, that a group like ISIL is really going to be hard. I mean, right now the U.S. is engaged in military efforts. That's obviously has to happen, but it's not sufficient. I don't think a group like ISIL can be beaten only militarily. I mean, there's this ideology that has been talked about in other panels is very appealing to some people for whatever reasons. And so I think, there's a lot of countering the ideology, including the people who it's being targeted at in the United States. But and again, also this idea that religious freedom is part of this effort. If you have a society, if you have a world with religious freedom, you hopefully marginalize groups like that. But it's a real concern.
No, because one of the roots of ISIS is, in fact, it's sectarian rather than religion on religion, but the conflict between the Shia and the Sunni had a lot to do with the
lack of religious freedom.
Leading
to the rise of this group. Yeah.
Actually, that was the point that I was just about to make, that I think that with respect to your question, I think the time is always. I think that as far as when are we having, anytime there is persecution of any groups, people of faith rise to the occasion of having these conversations. And I think oftentimes that doesn't get as much play as what those conversations are happening in sort of interfaith relationships and work. And I was just about to say, with respect to ISIL or ISIS, and I don't have the stats handy, but I know that the death toll amongst Muslims, is very high, right? So they are targeting Muslims, Muslims are dying. And so I don't really want to think about this issue, that particular issue as, within Islam and without Islam. I think that it's a concern for all people of faith because it's not, it doesn't have anything to do with faith, in fact. I think, again, and I keep beating this sort of dead horse of education, but I think Muslims should be reminded that the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, wrote a letter to all Christians till the end of time, charging Muslims with the fact that we have a duty and obligation to protect Christians, their places of worship, and their holy, their clergy. And so as a person of faith and who ascribes to Islam, I take that mandate very seriously because the Prophet actually said, you will be cursed if you don't defend the rights of Christians. We are making this promise to the Christian world till the end of time. And so I think we need to be reminded of that charge, and when we talk about interfaith relationships and dialogue. I don't know also about the Let Girls Run. Unfortunately, I've heard about the movement. I haven't read the documents. I think that the only thing I'll say with respect to that is that there should be a conversation about access to education, and I think that that's where religious freedom comes in, whether it's in vague terms or much more with specificity, this idea that women and girls of all religious faith traditions should have access to education, and that, there are different kinds of education, whether they are secular or religious. And then with the final question, really quickly, I think that there's been, especially, KARAMAH, because we're focusing on gender equity issues, we look a lot at interpretations of religious text. And as I said in my previous comments, I think that there are, we call, in Arabic, it's called tafsir, interpretation of the Quran. There's many tafsir written by women, and there's a lot of tradition that talks about how women were narrating the traditions of the Prophet and were analyzing religious mandates and tradition and scripture itself. That, again, has been shoved aside because of patriarchy. So it's not to say that women are not engaged in interpretation of the text, and I think that you can definitely track history of when even Arabic as a language has been slowly eroded in Muslim communities, so that people are robbed of the opportunity to be able to read the scripture in its original form and understand it. And I think that those stories need to be brought forth, and there's definitely women scholars at KARAMAH who are publishing articles all the time, and you can go to our website about interpreting text from a gender perspective.
I would offer two quick comments. One on the Let Girls Learn. I don't know the curriculum, but I've done some work at the UN since 1994, the Beijing and Cairo conferences, and then more recently on the CSW, the Commission on the Status of Women, and the Commission on Population and Development, all like neuralgic stuff on women. And what you find is always that groups that want to take on a particular issue don't want to ruffle feathers on others. So you'll have certain feminist groups in the US that will get very crazy, upset about something in particular, but if something is going on in another country that it's not their interest, they'll just stay silent on it, right? Even though clearly, if they were to be logically consistent, they would speak up. And in the same way, I know when I've done work at the UN sometimes on the issue of the family, it's with an array of countries who really do not evidence all the time religious freedom principles. And you're trying to say, let's make some moves together on the family, and then maybe another time, let's make some moves together on religious freedom because it serves the family or the family serves religion, however you do it. But it wouldn't be the first time that a group with a particular agenda said, maybe we do this without ruffling feathers. But the fact is, sometimes you can't move your agenda without engaging these other issues. So when I see someone like the administration, for instance, now trying to promote women without promoting this ethic of sexual integrity, responsibility, I'm saying you're not really going to get a lot of women too far if you don't allow that ethic at least to be spoken. On the question of texts, being Roman Catholic, obviously, we've been grappling with St. Paul for a while. And there's many ways people approach that, right? Some people say, all historically conditioned. None of it really means what you think it means. Everything's cool. That usually doesn't convince many people. The putting St. Paul in his context and saying that what he said, what Jesus said regarding women was actually this tremendous advance for the society of its time. Husband loves your wives. You can't set them aside by fiat in a divorce. So to point out that some of that was in the context of its times, amazing. Every once in a while, there's some really great books on that. I don't know if you've ever seen, there's a Yale scholar, Sarah Rudin, who wrote Paul Among the People. There's this incredible history. I think it's by an Oxford historian about the sexual transformation between the Roman Empire and the rise of Christianity, called From Shame to Sin. And they really, to someone who's willing to listen to what the Christian sexual ethic was saying, how they didn't speak to the lowborn. They said, no, highborn, you have to follow these rules too. They didn't just speak against, male-male couples. They said this also applies to females couples. They egalitarianized the whole thing. It was a great accomplishment. The final thing, though, is that there are some texts. Like, for instance, Pope Francis has been dealing with the text that says, Genesis repeats 3 times, image of God in the world is most glimpsed in humanity through the union of the man and the woman. You'd think that was not controversial like 5 minutes ago, and now it's very controversial, right? And he even said, I think the way that people are falling away from religion is because they no longer understand marriage. If they don't understand marriage, they're missing the opportunity to glimpse God, who the scriptures say is revealed in marriage. So sometimes there's just going to be texts where we do our best job explaining, this is our text. And then my background is always to say, and I think common sense and empirical data can help unpack this and show you why this is actually still the case. But sometimes you have to grapple with texts that people just don't like. And then sometimes there are these marvelous treatments that evidence the translations, the historical context.
The one thing I'd add to that is, as Helen says, some of these texts are very difficult for us. But we do believe, those of us who are people of faith, in the supernatural. And it does require us to believe that there's a God who transcends our understanding. And some of this we come to understand over time through prayer. Mm-hmm. Let me point you to Proverbs 31, the end of that beautiful passage on the agency of women, and say something which I know is very on PC, which is the Bible teaches that there are gender roles. And right now, a lot of women don't think there should be any difference between men and women, that women should do everything that men do. And my son teaches in public school here in DC. He talks about little 9-year-old girls who fight like boys. That may be a world that some people want to live in. But not only do I think that that's not the world God intended, I think that's actually a very sad world, where there is women no longer see it as valuable to be different, to be perhaps mediators, peacemakers, but rather what you should do is meet the challenge with your fists in the same way in which a man would. So forgive me if I'm archaic, traditionalist, and on PC, but I think part of the problem is that the women's movement has been far too successful. We shouldn't be oppressed. We shouldn't be raped. We shouldn't have acid thrown in our faces. The rights of women should be protected and advanced, but that doesn't mean we have to turn into men.
All right. We still have 5 more minutes. Does anybody else have a question in the audience?
Could we just ask? I'm Tom Getman.
We've got a microphone right here coming your way.
Thank you. That leads us to lots of other questions. My name is Tom Getman, and I work half my time in Southern Africa. The demographic shift in Christianity has moved to the Southern Hemisphere. In West Africa, there are many women who are performing priestly functions because there aren't any priests. My daughter is a priest in South Africa and a PhD gender expert. What's the role, given your perspective, of women in the priesthood? Is there room for a priesthood of women? Priesthood of all believers, yes. Priesthood of women, maybe?
Okay. So let me issue a disclaimer. You know, I'm no expert. I struggle with the passages in the Bible that refer to that, and my position is not popular. I myself believe that I'm called by God to teach, but I don't think I'm called to be ordained, because I don't see the passages, putting it in context, taking all the history. I just cannot rise to that. In a situation where there is no one to teach and no one to be a priest, then I think women should play the role if there are no men. But it seems to me that that is an aberration. It's not God's perfect will for the church, and it's a situation we should seek to address. But I speak just as an ignorant laywoman.
How about in the other religions?
Yeah.
I think that was directed to me. So I think that, what's happening in the U.S., I think is very interesting. I think that there is no doubt in my mind that there have been, and I think I was named after one of the, my name is Aisha, and I was named after Aisha, the wife of the prophet, who was the leading scholar of her time amongst men and women. I find incredible strength in the fact that she taught men about their religion. She taught men and women about what the prophet taught. And so I think there's ample evidence in Islam for women being teachers and scholars of Islam. I think that, when we look at the role of an imam, especially in the U.S., I think it's a very interesting concept. We don't have hierarchy in Islam. And so I find, again, incredible value in that, because we believe that our relationship with God is direct. It's not through a person, whether an imam or other figure, or a scholar, male, female, it doesn't matter. And I think, my family comes from Pakistan. And in my travels there, I find it to be so interesting, because an imam really is just a leader of prayer. And they have so many mosques in so my family is from Karachi, and so at every street corner you're going to go to a mosque. And whoever is the most knowledgeable or senior in terms of age person is the one who is leading prayer. And it's a man, and I think that that is the function of an imam, and there's not any other function except for on Fridays they give sermons. We're seeing in the US and other parts of the world that there are regularly and routinely educational classes run by women, taught by women, to both men and women. So I look at it, so, you know, there's this whole movement of, well, should women be imams? I don't want to disrespect our imams. I think that there is a role for them. You know, there's an imam in the room that I'm, you know, so I don't want to disrespect them, but I just don't see, I think we're putting this power in a position that I don't know that was necessarily supposed to be there. And again, this idea of, is it one or the other? You know, so imams have power and then thus women don't have power. I just don't look at the world in those kind of binaries.
Okay. We're at our time, so thank you all for coming, and please thank our panelists for their excellent comments.
Thank you indeed.